I'm Lisa Mazzie, and I am here today, January 6th, 2018, with Carrie Menkel Meadow, who is a professor at UC Irvine and at Georgetown, and we're going to do her oral history today. So, Carrie, welcome and thank you.
Thank you.
We'll start at the beginning, which is where were you born and where did you grow up?
Very easy. Born in New York City the same year that the United Nations was born, which is one of the reasons I teach international law. And I grew up in New York City.
Okay, and did you have, can you tell me about your family growing up? Mother, father, siblings?
Sure. My parents were Holocaust refugees. My father was Catholic, my mother was Jewish. They're from the same town in Germany, Cologne, but they met in the United States. It's a great story. I plan to write a novel about it someday. My father had a German girlfriend, and when my father, who is politically quite progressive, which will come up again later here, my father and my grandfather were both leftists of various kinds. My father was going to leave and send for his girlfriend for Germany to come to the United States. And when she hadn't done that in 1941, my mother was on the last boat that made it across the ocean. The boat she came on was sunk on the way back. But my father's girlfriend had contacted her in Cologne, so when she got to New York to the refugee program, she contacted my father. And said, I have a message for you. Inga wants to know why you haven't sent for her yet. And my father famously to them said, to hell with Inga, what are you doing tonight? So it's a very interesting story. The reason I would write a novel about it is that they were from the same town, Cologne, which was primarily a Catholic city. And as I was a child, they would tell stories about having been in the same place. Middle class dancing school and symphony, and all kinds of things. But my mother was behind the yellow ribbon with a yellow star, and essentially apartheid in Nazi Germany in the late 30s. So I tell you all this to say that I grew up, you can tell, in a progressive household. I was raised in ethical culture, which is one of the secular humanist religions, two atheist parents, but in my Sunday school class that I went to and was confirmed in 8th grade, every year we studied another religion. So that all led to my being a civil rights lawyer, a person who believes in difference and diversity. It's all part of my makeup as a child.
Kind of all woven into your background.
I have a brother.
Oh, you have a brother? Is he older or younger?
He's a younger brother, poor thing, as you can tell. I was the talker in the family. My brother is an intensive care doctor in New York and a very silent fellow, and I love him dearly.
Silent because you were the talker?
Yes, indeed. Couldn't get a word in edgewise.
So, if you had to pick maybe two adjectives to describe yourself as a young child, what would you use?
Great question. Ironically, shy, and at the same time, a big mouth. I was very shy socially, but apparently in 3rd grade, my teacher gave me an N in respects the rights of others because I was correcting her all the time. So I was shy around my peers and terrified of social contact, but I read a lot. You know, I was one of those annoying little people who knew a lot, and so apparently she didn't like being corrected. What I remember very vividly is that at one point we were studying something and she said something about quinine water, and I said the correct pronunciation is quinine. Or I don't even know what the right one is anymore. I just know she was wrong, I was right. My mother told me to shut up and listen to the teacher. And I looked it up, and I went in the next day, and I got bad grades from her for the rest of the...
Amazing how that worked. Huh?
Fortunately, 3rd grade didn't count for getting into law school.
Right. So what kind of schools did you go to then? So you're in New York. You went to public school
all the way through. I never had children of my own. We'll get into that later. I've been married for 45 years. My husband went to my high school. We were not high school sweethearts, but I'm a firm believer in public education. New York City public high schools. My high school was completely diverse. Every ethnic group you can imagine. African American, Latino, we didn't call it, they were mostly Puerto Ricans in those days in New York, but my friends were always quite, from many different backgrounds. In that part of New York City, many of us immigrant kids, or the children of immigrants, and the quality of the education was quite wonderful. I was in lots of honors classes, but the most important thing was when I got to college, Barnett College at Columbia University. I'll never forget when I went to register, the registrar said, "You're in the wrong line, you should be in the seniors line." And I said, "I'm not a senior, I'm a freshwoman." They said freshman in those days. And she said, "You can't possibly be a fresh person, you're so mature." And I wasn't mature at all, I was quaking in my insides, but it was that New York toughness. I had started riding the subways and going to Manhattan from when I was 12 years old by myself.
Right.
So there was something about the street smarts and the toughness of a huge New York City. My high school had 2,000 kids in it. So I attribute a lot of what happened to me later in life from having had a really terrific public school education in which it wasn't just the classes, but the community.
The larger area. Did you say you had a lot of like advanced classes, and so obviously a very smart student, except your third grade teacher didn't like you, but very smart student. Did you have any idea growing up and as you're getting into high school what you wanted to do growing up? What did your parents? You said they were immigrants and your dad was progressive. What did they do?
My dad was an engineer.
Okay.
Had he stayed in Germany, he would have been an architect. My father, who died at the last time I went to an AALS meeting 4 years ago in New York, was 93 when he died. He wanted me to be a scientist. I owe so much of what I am today to a father who had a daughter who visited all of his ambitions on his daughter. And when my younger brother was born, he didn't change a thing. So he was very proud of me later, but he wanted me to be an astronomer. So when I was a kid in New York, he took me to the Hayden Planetarium constantly, and Natural History Museum. He took me to the Young People's Concerts with Leonard Bernstein. And
were you interested in that, like, so that he was feeding off of something you were interested
nope,
in, or that
it was
what
his
he
interest.
His,
it was
his
absolutely
interest.
his interest. And I was a reader. I wanted to be a novelist. So I wanted to do literature.
Right.
But he just was proud of me, and he wanted me to be well educated. And when I had trouble in math, which I did, he helped me every night with the only time I needed help in homework was with geometry and calculus and that stuff. And he was incredibly helpful and never said a word that he was disappointed. At some point, he was quite young. When he was 45, he had a heart attack. And my brother was quite young, and I think that influenced my brother to become a doctor. So then fortunately for me, my brother took on the science part. My brother got interested in science and was pre-med, and they let me alone to go do social science and literature.
Right.
And my mom was a full-time 1950s housewife, and my mother's not a Betty Friedan feminist at all. My mother's only regret was she probably would have had 6 children if she could have. She loved children. She had 2 kids and then had a bunch of miscarriages. And if it had been up to her, she would have stayed home and raised a whole brood of us. At the same time, she knew from when I was a little girl that I was going to have a career. And she couldn't have been more supportive either. She said, "I don't care what you do, you can have a career, but you have to get married." And I did. And I did. So I was a good girl. And the joke, of course, growing up in New York at that time, if you were a woman, girl, be sure to get your teaching credential so you can be a teacher. So our family joke many years later was, "I did just what you told me, Mom. I got married, and I'm a teacher."
Yes, just not quite what they were thinking. So you wanted to be a novelist. So when you were in high school then, what were you thinking you would do?
Always 2 tracks. I wrote diaries like every kid our age did. Lots of diaries. I wrote short stories. Never got published like many people did. But I was also very political. So one thing I have to tell you about my high school that also formed my identity. My horrible, good education, big high school had a sorority and fraternity system. They were illegal, but they had them. I was rejected by every sorority. It was all about the clothes at the time. You know, you laughed because of Hillary Clinton. You had to have a headband that matched your outfit. And my parents, I learned later, had plenty of money, but I wasn't raised that way. It's New York City, I couldn't shop in Saks. I was raised very modestly, and I think my clothes were not fancy enough for these sororities. It marked me because my mother would say, if she were here, the hardest moment of her life when she was a mother was not when I had operations, little cysts and all that stuff, was when I got rejected from these sororities. I cried for 2 months and there was nothing she could do. It was very painful. I now say, for my civil rights experience, it taught me, even though I was a white girl and half Jewish in a Jewish community, I was an outsider. And I never forgot that.
Right.
So I ran for office in high school, and I ran for office on the sorority fraternity party, ha ha ha, just to get back at all those people that rejected me. And I lost the office. The other party was the independent party. Those were the beatniks. Those were my friends. Those were the poets and the writers. And I was at that point hanging out in Greenwich Village, picture, hair down to here, white lipstick, black eyeliner. So I probably should have run in the independent party, and I'm sure I was sabotaged by the sorority girls.
Right.
But the good thing, again, for becoming a lawyer was I gave speeches, and that's where I met my husband. He was the chairman of the Nominations and Elections Committee of our high school.
Ah.
He is today a political pollster. So the irony, when you think of this high school thing, we weren't dating, but if you look back at it, it would look like it was preordained what we wound up doing.
Right. So you mentioned in high school you were pretty political. Was there something that got you there? Was it just the times, or was there some other influence that got you there?
As I mentioned, my grandfather and my father were both progressive leftists in Germany, and I was in high school during Vietnam, so I will never forget this either. Another formative event, 1965, I went to the first Peace March in Central Park. Pouring rain. And this is, again, one of these great formative moments. The New York Times said that there were 10,000 people there, but it was Sheep Meadow, and those of us that were there would say there were easily 1 million people. I want to say two things about that. One is I never trusted journalism again, ever, even though I'm often quoted or interviewed by journalists. Don't trust them, and many of them are my friends. And the second thing was I came home that day, bedraggled and wet, and my parents were having a dinner party of a whole bunch of their German refugee friends, who I'm sure all voted Democratic. But one of them said to my father, "How can you let your daughter demonstrate against this country that took us in?" And my father said, "That's why we came to this country, so we could do this." And my father and I then argued with the rest of the dinner party, broke up the whole dinner party. My mother was, mortified. These were her closest friends. And my father and I were very political. We always were. And my mother probably saved my father's life because he was going to move to the Soviet Union to help build the subway. That's how lefty he was. And my mother turned him into a family man, much more bourgeois than I think he ever would have been. But I think my less bourgeois, I'm now pretty bourgeois too, but my political commitments came from him. And so we had a bond, my father and I, over politics. And he was very proud of every disruptive thing I ever did. While she, as a mom, was, stop doing that. You're not going to get into college, or you're not going to get into this, or whatever.
Or no one will want to marry you. It's not very lady. It's not very lady.
And speaking of that, I just do have to throw in here. My husband then in high school, so this was 65. In 1964, I remember him as being in the Young Republicans supporting Barry Goldwater. And we have fought about that ever since, because he claims it's not true. He's a very progressive Democrat now, but he was then. And so it's interesting. I wouldn't go out with him in high school because he was politically inappropriate. And now he's done more, than anybody I know to actually work for Democratic good people to get into office. So
Right.
life turns around.
Yes. So you're in high school, and now everybody seems to expect you're going to go to college, right? Nobody assumes that you're not,
Right.
although you do still have to get married. So when you were looking for colleges, as you mentioned, you went to Barnard. So what made you go there? What was your thought?
Well, that's an interesting thing too. So big New York City high school, this is the kind of stuff people would sue over now. When I went to high school, the school would only allow you to apply to 3 schools. And the third one had to be one of the city university campuses. And they would only provide 2 transcripts. I think these days kids would sue. So, and my high school was so big, there was known to be a quota system, meaning that all the New York City schools were so big and had lots of smart kids in them. So our school sent 1 girl to Radcliffe and 1 boy to Harvard and no more. And I wasn't at the very top. I know exactly where I was. I was 12th in my class. I was not at the very top, so I knew I wasn't going to Radcliffe. And so I applied to the University of Pennsylvania, as did my now husband, then just friend, where I didn't get in. And I was a city kid, so I applied to Barnard and then to one of the city schools. And I went to Barnard because 2 things. On college night at my high school, all of the Seven Sisters School recruiters were Miss, except for the recruiter from Barnard, who was Mrs. somebody. And my mother said, "You can go there. Very smart people there, and they get married." Now, my mother's a German immigrant, very smart,
Yeah.
thrown out of school by Hitler, and I think in probably the equivalent of ninth grade, but a reader all of her life. But she was looking at these, symbols and these markers. So Barnet was Columbia, that was good, and it was in New York City, so I would stay home. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, hated every minute of that. But the symbolism was that you could go to Barnet and get married. She turned out to be wrong because Barnet was very much then a women's college. We had almost no formal relations with Columbia across the street. I wound up taking courses at Columbia, but it was very bureaucratic and difficult to do. And Barnet was like any other Seven Sisters school. On Fridays, the girls all got into buses and went to Dartmouth and Yale and all the men's colleges. Mm-hmm. I didn't. I went to the Village and thought I was very sophisticated and hung out in the cafes and had espressos, and I never slept with them, but picked up all kinds of inappropriate men. So my mother would have been a lot happier if I hadn't gone to Barnet.
Right.
But it was a very intellectual place. And so
what year did you start?
Started 1967.
1967.
And I was still going to Vietnam. I mean, the other attraction to New York was I could keep marching.
Right. Okay. So when you started, and what were you intending to major in?
Well, I intended to major in English. And then it turned out at Barnet that the English majors were all girls that had gone to the fancy prep schools in New York, Chapin and Dalton and all that stuff. And I had taken advanced placement English. I'd done very well, but I had no idea, smart girl that I was, what relationship Chaucer had to Shakespeare chronologically. And the prep school kids all really knew all this stuff. So I said, okay, I'm going to take as many English literature courses as I can, but I'm going to do something more political. Always this, literature, politics. So I majored in sociology, and I had one of my mentors, Mira Komarovsky, was one of the leading sociologists, she was a Russian emigre. Very, very elegant woman. We ultimately stayed in touch until she died. She was a family sociologist, and her big research project, which affected me very greatly, was in the 1930s. She had studied women during the Depression, and it turned out that women that went to work, who were happy about working, raised children that were happier than women who either had to work because they had to and didn't like it, or stayed home. Wow. So through Mira's instruction, I felt empowered to want to be a working woman, and at the time thinking I could still be a mother. And it was very powerful. And Mira was a very elegant and very distant, proper person. So she was my advisor. I did my thesis with her. In those days, you had to do a full thesis in college. So I wrote a 200-page thesis. But she was very proper, and it was only after I graduated and she would invite me over to tea that we became friends. And as we'll get into later, we used to argue because one of my famous articles, Portia in a Different Voice, argued for women being different. Mira was a classic Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Wendy Williams, my friends, equality feminist.
Yes.
But Mira and I had this very wonderful thing. So the only other thing I need to say about college is that I did join Students for Democratic Society. In Columbia in 1968, we took over buildings. And I was very radical. And this is one of my favorite stories. I was then dating my husband, who had gone to high school, couldn't get a date for some important football weekend at Penn, so he invites me to Penn. We have these, long, soulful conversations about whether we should be friends or lovers. By the end of my freshman year, we were boyfriend and girlfriend. I'm in a building. He's a Navy ROTC at Penn, and he calls me up and he says, if you want to keep dating me, you have to come to the Navy ball. I go home, I pick up my senior prom dress. I went to the senior prom with a friend, not with a date. I pick up my yellow senior prom dress. I leave my building, my occupied building at Columbia. I go to Philadelphia. We go to the Navy ball. Martin Luther King gets shot. And we're told that the ball is over and we all have to go home. And I'm going, yay, and rah, rah, all my radical stuff. And when I go back to Columbia, I'm now a traitor. Having left the building,
yes,
they won't let me back in.
Ah.
So I do have to say, because it's very important for forming who I became, a group of us decided nonviolence. We'd heard rumors that the Columbia administration was going to call the police on the occupiers. So about 200 of us, Columbia and Barnet students, decided that if we just slept on the bricks of the campus, there's no way that the police would step on us. And that is where my mediation career began. Because I was not allowed to be inside with the activists, and my three best friends were not involved at all. They were very angry at me. They thought I was going to get in trouble, that I was going to get arrested, and then I couldn't go to law school. And so I slept for 4 nights on some bricks, which I now regard as my bricks when I go back to the campus. I go visit my bricks. And I was wrong. Columbia called the police. They stepped on us. They beat a bunch of us up. I was extremely fortunate. I wasn't hurt. A bunch of my friends were arrested. I was not among them. But famously, I don't know if these tapes are going to be censored, I was screaming, "The cops eat shit, you are what you eat," or all kinds of horrible epithets. And the New York Times reported the next day that a bunch of very surly Barnard students were heard screaming epithets at the police.
Did your mother ask you, was that you?
My mother was just concerned that I not get arrested. My father said, "Right on." And so I just, again, just to foreshadow something, it was pretty funny. The next day, all the university students in Manhattan, we had a huge march. There were 7 demands for Columbia 68. The university was going to build a gym in Harlem and put up a very big brick wall. Mm-hmm. Military-industrial complex, the Columbia Physics Department had been working on war stuff. There were 7 demands. I don't need to go through all 7 of them, but we had a big solidarity march, and for some reason I wasn't a leader. I was at the front, and when we got to the front, a then Columbia law professor named Michael Sovereign was in the front of the line, and he was trying to calm things down immediately. He was a labor law professor. He tried to calm things down, and I remember screaming all kinds of horrible epithets at him. Fast forward about 25 years, and I am on the AALS, yay, AALS Accreditation Committee for Columbia. Mike Sovereign is the president of Columbia University. The dean of Columbia at that time, who may have been interviewed for this project, is Barbara Black. And when we get to the exit interview in his fancy office, which was the office famously on the front page of the New York Times, where the student leaders, I wasn't among them, had their feet on the presidential table, he looks at me and he says, "You look very familiar. Do I know you from somewhere?" And I said, "Well, we're both law professors and I teach labor law, but I think you might remember my face from 1968 when I screamed all kinds of horrible things at you."
Wow.
And Mike Sovereign said, "Well, you must have cleaned up your act, young lady," I wasn't that young anymore, "or you wouldn't be where you are now."
Wow.
And so again, it's, my life is full of these funny little anecdotes. And the only other thing I'll say for posterity was at the time I learned afterwards that Mike Sovereign and Barbara Black were having awful fights about Columbia's support of the law school needed some more money. And this is a feminist law professor project. I long believed that he never would have behaved that way to a male dean.
Right.
And shortly thereafter, Barbara resigned.
Wow. Yeah. So
if you're listening, Michael Sovereign, we remember.
So going back now to the college, so you mentioned that your friends were worried that you get arrested and wouldn't go to law school. So now law school is in your mind when you are a sociology major and you want to do that.
Right. So again, 2 paths always. What was hard was, you're going to laugh, before SDS in high school, after this election thing, I had determined I was going to be the first woman senator from New York, and it's in my blood. My mother survived the Holocaust only because she was related to Herbert Lehman, who had been the governor and senator from New York State. And my mother left in 1941, and the only reason she survived was that the Lehman family did a private bill to find all their relatives in Germany, and because the immigration quotas were all filled. So I never had much contact with any of those fancy relatives. But when I say this, it's sort of funny. My mother was quite surprised when I said all these very ambitious things, because she said, it actually runs in the family. Do you want me to call some of these people up and introduce you to them? And I said, no, not on your life. I'm going to do this on my own. But then when I was in SDS, I'd become radical, and so I knew there was probably some FBI file on me. So I never did conventional politics. So I was going to apply to law school, thinking that I was ultimately a poverty lawyer, that I was going to do Lawyers Guild, more radical lawyering on the one hand, and I also applied to sociology graduate school at the same time. So ideally what I wanted was to do a joint degree. I thought, I'm going to have this activist life if I go to law school, but I also really love sociology, and I would love to teach it. So I applied to a number of places that would have allowed me to do both.
Right, okay. And where were you accepted then?
So I was accepted in lots of places. Columbia where I had gone to college would have let me do exactly what I wanted. PhD in sociology, which was a big deal. There weren't very many women in the graduate program in law school, but I was getting the hell out of New York. I really had it by that time, and that upset my mother. My parents wanted me to stay there. My husband was applying to graduate school in political science at the time.
Okay, was he a husband by then?
We got married right after college.
Okay.
We traveled in Europe together during college. Oh, and the other good thing about my parents was, Bob and I were not married. This is 1969, 70. We went to visit my relatives in Germany, the Catholic side of the family, and to go to all the concentration camps. And unmarried, my parents knew we were traveling together. Bob joined us. So as a family, my parents, my brother, my boyfriend, and I traveled together. My parents got a room for Bob, my husband, and I. They put my little brother in there to supervise. But we were all there together. And so we got married right after college because once we decided to go to Penn, we were hired to be married counselors in the newly built tall tower undergraduate dorms. And they were hiring graduate students that were married and married only. They wanted couples to be counselors. So I would have not gotten married because at that point in my political development, marriage was a bourgeois institution. And I would have been perfectly happy just hanging out together. I was the one going to law school. My husband was nervous that if we weren't actually married, that they would catch us and we would both get thrown out of school. That is where Menkel Meadow comes from, because I would have stayed Menkel. Okay. But when we got married for these graduate assistant jobs, because we were on the payroll of Penn, I had to have his name as a married couple, and I wasn't giving up Menkel, so that's how I became Menkel Meadow. Okay. And so we were married when we started graduate school. He in political science and me in law school.
At Penn?
At Penn.
At Penn, okay.
And being mommy and daddy to 80 undergrads for 3 years. And
there's probably a question in there somewhere, but when you started law school then in 1976, 71? 71, okay. How many women were at Penn?
So we were a transitional year. The class before me, there were almost none. My class was 200 total, and there were 30 women. And after me, there were 60 women. So it was very quick. I was still of the generation, if you've read about it, that there was Ladies' Day. So I had a couple of very, very old-fashioned Kingsfield-type professors. The men didn't have to wear suits anymore, but we had to stand up to recite cases. Right. And my torts teacher, Clarence Morris, who at the time was second only to Prosser, would say on Tuesday afternoons, it's Ladies' Day, "Miss Menkel Meadow, would you please recite the facts in such and such a case?" And then he tore into us. Turned out later, Professor Morris had all of his students over for dinner, very formal dinners. We all had a dress for dinner. It turned out his wife, I forget her last name, was Marcus, was the heir to the Neiman Marcus, department store, Right. So it was it was very bizarre. This is 1971, where many of us are very politically active, and it was like back to the 19th century. Formal dinner, African-American waiters in full livery. Wow. And in my law school class, we actually, in addition to the women, there were 10 African-Americans in my class. And so on either side of me, an African-American woman and an African-American man. And I think they just were shocked when they went to the dinner. So by the next year, when we told stories on this, people refused to go to the dinner. He still held them. But it was one of those dramatic moments of social change where for many years, people were very honored to go to this very fancy event. And then we were quite appalled by it.
Wow. So that answers one of the other questions about how it was being one of still very, very few women in a law school class. You still had Ladies' Day, you mentioned. What about the other students and other professors? How did you feel they were receptive or not receptive to women?
The great thing about Penn, it was a very small school. The professors were terrific. And I had as my professor first year, Martha Field, now at Harvard, the first woman on the Penn faculty, one of the first women to clerk on the Supreme Court. Smartest, toughest person, ultimately a friend after I graduated, because I joined the Penn faculty right after I graduated. What a wonderful role model, except, I don't know if you've interviewed Martha, but this is pretty interesting. When I was having these issues about my name, when she started, she was Martha Altschuler. She'd been married to Professor Altschuler at Chicago. They were divorced. And when I went to go see her, I said, how did you resolve this name issue? Are you Field or Altschuler? And she was very cold. So as one of the first women law professors, big issue for all of us women law professors, I think she was feeling her way about whether to stay a figure of authority in the classroom and not to get too close. So I was very upset at the time. She was very cold. She said, you know, never mind my personal life. You figure out what's right for you. But in general, to have a woman professor in those days was extraordinary. And Marty used to come to class in short skirts. The men were all after her. The women were all after her, because the brilliance in her brain and also her being quite
kind of
sexy, hot, they would say today,
was
really amazing. The thing that was wonderful about my 3 years at Penn, and I'm very grateful I went there, I almost went to Harvard, and I chose Penn over Harvard at the time because Penn was running the Reggie program for poverty lawyers, and that's what I wanted to do. We formed a group of the people that knew they were going to be public defenders or legal services lawyers. And so I had a peer group of about 15 to 20 students. There were 2 sections the first year. And we sort of bonded. And so now when I talk to students, I say, if you're going to be a public interest person, you need to find an affinity group. So when we actually got called on Socratically, we would refuse. Civil disobedience in the classroom.
And how did that go over?
It varied on the professor. Some professors got very angry. Some accepted, just went on to the next person. I'm now going to tell a story that, if this goes in the archives, is pretty funny. Visiting my second year was William Van Alstyne, one of the world's most renowned constitutional law professors. And it was a huge classroom, the biggest one the Penn had, about 200. And I was like eye level with him. He called on me all the time. I love con law, so unlike all my other classes where I was very shy and quiet and didn't want to be called on, I did respond. I never said no. My classmates thought I was breaking the rules by participating with him. But at some point, he called on me and I got angry and I said, Professor Van Alstyne, I think I'm being denied equal protection of the classroom. You are calling on me more than you're calling on anyone else. And he said this, Miss Menkel Meadow, everyone can see that you are very well endowed and you can answer my questions.
Wow.
And I was just shocked. Wound up later on, anonymous grading, so he didn't know. I got the highest grade in the class. And so when the year was over, he called me and he said, if you ever need anything from me, a recommendation, if you want to be a professor, let me know. And I said, I will never ask you for anything.
Wow.
So again, another interesting fast-forward story. Then many years later, also AALS, I have become trained to be a law school strategic facilitator for law schools that are doing planning activities. And Pam Gann, who is the Dean of Duke, invited me and my then partner, who is the Dean of WashU, to come and facilitate Duke's strategic planning. So we go out the night before, and I tell Pam this story. She's married to Bill Van Alstyne. That's the important part of this story. And she said, so I just want you to know that I have no idea if he remembers me. It's now 20-something years later. And she said, oh, don't worry about it. So Bill stays quiet throughout the entire retreat. And at the very end, makes some completely sarcastic remark that kind of upends the whole thing. Not me, it was actually more against Pam. And I thought to myself, nothing ever changes. They got divorced shortly thereafter. So again, these are all stories about, to anyone who's listening to this, whatever happens to you in your youth, these people will come back into your lives.
It circles back around.
So your mommies are right when they say, behave yourself or whatever, because what goes around comes around.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get the upper hand later on.
Right. So you're active in law school in the groups that you've formed and doing what you want to do, which is poverty law, right? And active in class, sort of trying to civil disobedience with the power structure. And were that group, were they men and women, or?
Yes, completely wonderful men and women. Ironically, my husband was in graduate school. There were 3 couples in that group, and they're all still married. And they all went to the West Coast, Seattle and Portland, and legal services, public defender, one of them became a judge. I stayed in touch with them for quite a long time, not recently. It was quite wonderful. The one thing that wasn't wonderful was when I made the law review, which was by grades. And I decided to do it because I was intellectually curious. Little did I know that I would have needed it to be a law professor. I wasn't thinking in those terms.
Right.
So again, I was sort of ostracized for doing something that group didn't think was cool.
Right.
So in our third year, that whole group went to New Orleans to go to Mardi Gras, and they didn't invite me. So again, back to the sorority rejection.
Right.
For anyone who's listened to this, it's very important if you're going to do what you want to do as a woman, sometimes to see that those rejections are incredibly important for character formation.
They're painful, but they're...
Exactly. They're horrible at the time, but when you do one of these things, reflecting on what you became in your life, they make you stronger. They really do. And they make you your own person.
Yeah.
And I don't regret it because being a law professor has been absolutely fabulous. I've loved every minute of it. And I probably wouldn't have been able to do it if I hadn't been on the law review.
Right, right. And you were editor-in-chief?
No, I was not editor-in-chief.
Okay,
I was just a little old lackey. I was a regular associate editor.
Okay.
But I published my student note. That was very important.
Very important. And what was that on?
That was interesting. This is the other thing that I did that was sort of politically inappropriate. I knew I was going to be a poverty lawyer, but I wanted a big firm experience. So the summer between second and third year, I went to one of the biggest law firms in Philadelphia, Decker, Price and Rhodes, which was wonderful to me. And I worked on a project. One of the major employers in Philadelphia, the Vietnam War was winding down, started to lay off the most recently hired people. So men were in the army, they hired women and blacks, and I was asked to defend an employment discrimination suit. And I had a wonderful mentor who was the head of the Labor Department. I said, I will not work on this case. And so I wrote my note on the conflict between Title VII and anti-discrimination law and the protections of union security and the National Labor Relations Act. I was going to be a labor lawyer. And so my note was called The Inevitable Interplay of Title VII and the NLRA. And I would say a lot of my career intellectually has been about laws and concepts that conflict with each other.
Right.
And that's why I became a mediator. I believe in ands, not buts.
Right.
And so I wrote this piece that actually came out of my experience. And the wonderful thing about Decker was that partner said to me, this is a firm that will let you do that. Not too often. If you keep saying you won't do this work, at some point.
Right.
But I got an offer after that, and I said, thank you very much, I'm going to be a poverty lawyer. But I stayed in touch with him. And it always left me with a very special feeling that was a firm, at least then, that didn't say you have to take everything.
Right. So one of the other things, so you mentioned, you were married throughout law school, and you were one of relatively few women. Were there a lot of married students?
No,
were there other married women?
Yeah. There was one of my closest friends, 10 years older than me, 3 children. Husband, incredibly distinguished physicist at Penn. His uncle had been a Nobel Prize winner, a lot of intellectual pressure in that family. And Nina Segre was amazing. She went to Decker to work after law school. She was so disciplined because she had 3 small children at home.
Right.
She did all of her studying during the day, locked her books in the locker room, and never cracked a book at night, and was second in our class. Brilliant. Wow. And so we bonded only because we were both married, but I didn't have children, and I was a grind. I mean, I really studied very hard. But again, a role model in a different way.
Right.
This is a woman who went to law school and did it her own way, and also went on the law review, and just enormous respect that I had for her. But other than she, everybody else was not married, and they were all dating each other.
Did your being married did you think give you any kind of different experience than?
Yeah, in a good way. I think I went to class, I went home. My husband and I, to this day, 45 years of marriage, on some little piece of paper before we got married, equality. One cooks, the other cleans. One makes the bed, one does the laundry. One takes the trash out, one collects the trash. 46 years later, we're still doing the same thing. And so there was stability. I went to school all day. I went home, either he cooked and I cleaned, or I cooked and he cleaned, and then we both studied.
Yeah, because he was in school too.
Right, exactly. So we were both students, we were working hard. On the weekends, we partied and played with our friends, but in graduate school. But I was very lucky that way, that there was some stability. And sometimes I went to the library, but more often than not, we studied in our graduate student housing. We also had to be available for the undergrads
For the undergrads, right.
who were having drug crises.
Oh dear. It was that time.
Yes, it was.
And then obviously you graduated, did well in law school, graduated, and had turned down the offer from the large firm. And what did you decide to do then? Did you have you wanted to be a poverty lawyer, do labor law? Did you have anything lined up?
Yeah, well, here's the other two things I did. I'm beginning to sound like a bit of a pain in the neck rebel. Penn at that time you appreciate this, had third-year students teaching legal research and writing, and I was one of those, and I loved it, and I didn't like the way the program was structured. I got a Third Circuit clerkship. To Penn's shock and dismay, I turned it down. I wrote a memo to the then dean, Bernie Wolfman, later professor at Harvard, and said, I want to restructure the legal writing program. So I got a job from Community Legal Services, the poverty law thing. I got an agreement from them I could put it off for a year. I want to stay here and I want to revamp the legal writing program. And I want you to give me enough money that I can travel to the top 10 or 15 schools and find out what they're doing. And Bernie said yes, because the faculty member that was in charge of legal research and writing was on sabbatical that year. So again, lessons to any person listening to this for how to run your career, study hard, determination, and then there's luck.
Right.
This fortuitous thing happened just because Bernie couldn't find a faculty member to supervise the program. So I developed a lifelong love of legal research and writing. I wrote a report, which if I could find it, I should have published, 150 pages on how legal research and writing was being taught at different schools. So that year I managed the program. I hired the third-year students. Right out of law school, I'm doing lectures. I love teaching. So ironically, I don't know if this will mean anything to anybody who watches this, my office was the office that had belonged to Tony Amsterdam, who, hero to many criminal defense lawyers, unbelievably brilliant man. He had been at Penn. By that time, he'd moved to Stanford. The office reeked of his cigar smoke. And people would come into my office and say, where's Tony? And I would say, he's gone. But I felt that I was in the presence, of a genius, and then I became a clinical professor, combination of legal research and writing and wanting students to be in role as they were learning. So I turned down the clerkship, which ultimately could have been a problem for becoming a professor. I had to explain that to people when I went on the job market. But I think structuring my own job, I wrote a memo, this is what I want to do, and getting this thing showed that I had some initiative. So I'm very proud of having rejected the path that everyone who wanted to be a professor would have taken, law review and then clerking. I think I wouldn't have been able to be a professor if I rejected both of them. But I published my note and then I refused to clerk. And I'm glad, because I was a straight through girl. No gap years, no work experience. And so, right out of law school, I was running my own program and nobody cared what I was doing. So I was in charge, and it was a very important experience.
So by the time you graduated, did you have an inkling in the back of your mind that you did want to teach at some point?
Nope.
You were just still,
went to Community Legal Services, was immediately overwhelmed, had 300 or 400 cases all at once.
Oh,
unbelievable. I used to cry in my office. My birthday's Christmas Eve. During that 2-year period, it's the only time in my life I had to work on my birthday. I was writing a class action complaint, and I was sobbing that, this wasn't what I had in mind. So I worked unbelievably hard. And again, luck. The person who'd been hired at Penn, Professor Mark Spiegel, my mentor and dear friend, had come from Chicago to start Penn's clinical program. And he called me up and asked, would I be willing to be one of the supervisors at CLS of students that were in Penn's clinical program. So their class component was at the law school, and then I would supervise them. So I said, absolutely, and I did that for 2 years and realized I loved teaching. So in I guess this would have been 1978, so I was out of law school for 4 years, Penn decided to bring their clinic in-house. And so I went to Penn as a clinical, untenured, non-tenured track. I think we were called clinical lecturers. And I was in heaven. I loved it.
So how long did you do that, and how did you get from there to all the places that you've been after, which involve tenure and lots of writing?
So again, very, very luckily in many respects, I love that job. In so many ways, the best job I ever had, and I wasn't particularly status-oriented. The clinicians were starting to make noises about, equal status. And I worked with wonderful people. Mark The person who I hired, though he was older than me, Doug Frankel, who ultimately became the director of the program when I left. So I loved it, and I probably would have stayed, but my husband finished his PhD, and he was going on the market as a political science professor. And then it was becoming clear that Mark Spiegel wasn't going to get tenure at Penn, and I got very angry. He had written one terrific article on informed consent, but it was just at the time when tenure standards were changing from one article to two. So I got sort of angry at Penn. And I think if that hadn't happened, I probably would have stayed there in secondary status for the rest of my life, and maybe had 4 kids and stayed in Philadelphia and had a totally different life. But again, fortuity. My husband went on the market, so I said, okay, I'll go on the market. And again, anyone who's listening to this, I was the first year that the AALS ran a separate hiring market from this meeting, which used to be the hiring market. There was a blizzard in Chicago, so the Yale alums never made it to the meeting. And in that weekend, I think I had 45 interviews. Because the Yaleys weren't around, and you can tell I easily talk. So I mean, I just interviewed up and down the whole, range of schools. And I got a lot of callbacks. And I wound up at UCLA because at that point, bless UCLA's heart, they already had 3 clinicians, and they decided that they wanted to have a tenure track bunch of clinicians. Because David Binder, who was running the clinical program, believed that clinical professors should write about lawyering and make that a field. So I interviewed there, and I loved it. The sun was shining. For those of you going back to the
to the frozen,
snowy, right,
yes,
Milwaukee and other places.
right.
And David and I just hit it off intellectually. He was writing about trial processes, and I was interested in negotiation, and I just thought it was going to be wonderful. And then I learned, and this happened, I got an offer from Northwestern's clinical program too, that I learned, which is often true for many of us, there were inside candidates in both places. So I got a bunch of nasty phone calls from students who's at the 2 places who said, if you get this job, don't take it, because we love X person and we don't want you here. The call from Northwestern was particularly nasty, and the inside candidate there was a law school classmate of mine at Penn. So I turned Northwestern down. My husband always wanted to move to California, and he got a job at UCSD.
Okay. Yes, so I was going to ask how you manage that when you're both on the market at the same time.
So in those days, with that 2 academic couples, it was heaven to have jobs that were 125 miles away from each other.
Right.
So we bought a house in LA. Because as a clinical professor, I had to be in the office every day or in court, and as an academic, he didn't have to be there every day. So he took the train to San Diego. And I will just say to anyone who's listening, everyone will always tell feminists you can have it all. Well, in my generation, you couldn't. We had a
I don't
very,
think you can anyway.
Anytime, right? We had very good professional lives, but with that kind of commuting, train, but we did every form. He flew, he took the train, he took the bus from downtown LA. We never had children because in those crucial years of childbearing, we were almost always together every night, but sometimes in San Diego. Couldn't do it now. I just drove down here. In those days, we did it in 2 hours. Now it's like 4 hours because of traffic. And so, we both had very nice jobs, but we never knew where we were going to be in a particular evening. So he taught political science and communications at UCSD. And then I had made a condition of my coming to UCLA that I was interested in employment discrimination and labor law, and I wanted to teach some substantive courses as well as clinical stuff. And the wonderful dean, who just died recently, William Warren, bless his heart, said, sure, anything you want. So I was very lucky, but I will say this, my teaching load the first 2 years, anybody listening? Basically 5 courses. Going to court every day. I taught a trial ad program in which we tried both landlord-tenant cases and child abuse cases. One was in Santa Monica on the west side, and the other was downtown, in the very same building that O.J. Simpson was later tried in.
Wow.
So I was on the road with students trying cases and then also teaching 2 or 3 classes. That's another reason I didn't have children in those years. I can't imagine it now, and then being expected to write.
Right.
So you won't appreciate this. The way we did this, every law school has stratification. Having gone from Penn, where I was a 12-month employee and I was in charge of all my cases in the summer, UCLA's structure was that the clinicians were between the academics and the legal research and writing teachers. So the legal research and writing teachers were our TAs in the clinical program. On May 1st, the clinical professors got to go home and write, and the legal writing instructors took over our caseload.
Wow.
So this is one of these little known pieces of legal education history that people don't know. One of the reasons UCLA could have tenured Lucy White, Jerry Lopez, Al Moore, David Binder, and me in those early years was because in the summer we could write.
Right. Wow.
And the legal writing instructors had hell to pay because they had to take over cases that
Right.
weren't their own.
Right. I'm just trying to envision that.
Yeah.
So when you went to UCLA, were you as a clinician though, which is kind of a sort of the expected place for women to be in academia, did you feel you kind of said you didn't really feel any status difference, or did you feel?
Oh no, I should mention the other reason I went to UCLA was I was the fourth woman on the faculty.
Even though you're in a clinician role, though.
But Barbara Bridnow, who had interviewed me, was their first woman. She had done, it was pretty funny, the advice she's the one who interviewed me at the meat market. She looked at my resume, she said, get out of this poverty law stuff. And I said, what are you talking about? Barbara Bridnow at that point had written the first casebook on poverty law. She said, if you want to be tough, you should take up commercial law, corporations, and get out of this, soft, mushy social welfare stuff. And Allison Anderson and Susan Westerberg Prager, ultimately president of the AALS and all that stuff, they were there. Susan Prager became the associate dean and was my friend. And then Carol Goldberg Ambrose, who became a very close friend of mine. I wasn't the first. And they never treated me differently for being a clinician, I have to say. So it was, at the time, I don't think it's so much anymore for reasons I'm not going into on the tape, incredibly communitarian, supportive place. The goal was to get everybody tenure.
Right.
And I had a sabbatical before tenure.
Wow. Did the men on the faculty treat you differently as because
No,
you're a clinician?
It was a great place. So Murray Schwartz, who had been the dean before Bill Warren and was a real tough cookie, my friends at Penn told me that he and I were probably going to hate each other. So when I got there, Murray was teaching the required legal profession course and had one of the few textbooks. Murray was a brilliant Kingsfield Socratic teacher. Murray heard that I was doing very well as a teacher. So in my second year, he said, I'm getting bad teaching evaluations in legal profession, required third year course. Amazing man. Would you come to my class and watch what's going on? And as a pedagogue, which is what I was, teaching other people how to teach, would you tell me what's happening? So I went to his class for a whole semester, and I said, it's a third year required course. They're bored out of their minds. You're doing Socratic stuff, and they're telling you to go to hell. You need to make something happen in the classroom. And in that moment, I decided to write role plays using simulation models for teaching legal ethics. And so he asked me to join his textbook. And I mean, he was my academic father in some bizarre way. Our politics were totally different. He knew I'd been a rebellious pain in the neck. And I'm sure he was a Democrat, but he was a very conservative dean. And so whatever arguments I later had, and I had many of them with David Binder, who hired me, I have no doubt that Murray Schwartz was my protector behind my back. Because I helped him teach. He inspired to this day, teaching virtually every class I teach with some role play or simulation. He learned from a young woman. And we had lots of fights later on. After I got tenure, we would often fight over who should get tenure and who shouldn't. But, so again, anyone listening, almost every successful woman would tell you somewhere along the way they had mentors of both male and female. Right. And Murray was mine.
Right. So let's talk about that politicized Carrie that was there from the very beginning. Did she go away when she started teaching?
Never. And so the funny thing about Murray was Murray had been dean at UCLA during the Vietnam stuff. And it's ironic to do this interview today. One of my colleagues then was a man named Bill Graham, son of Kay Graham, publisher of the Washington Post. And Bill had the office next to me, and I didn't know this, but Bill had gone to Stanford and UCLA Law School to get away from his family and was a big anti-Vietnam War demonstrator. We became friends without my realizing who he was. And Murray kept telling me to get away from Bill. and I had no idea why. I learned later that Bill had been a pain in the ass at UCLA as an undergrad, as a law student when Murray had been dean.
Right.
And so Bill used to invite me over to his Hollywood Hills house, and we grew very fond of each other. And one day I went to the bathroom in his house, and I saw a picture of him sitting on the lap of JFK and his mom and his brothers and sisters. And I remember coming out and saying, "Oh, you're that Bill Graham." And he said, "That's one of the reasons you're my friend, because I figured out that you didn't care," or something like that. And so we were sort of slightly pains in the neck together. But because everybody expected that someday he would donate a lot of money to UCLA, it was this really interesting balance that we had, that I was sort of the strident one, but Bill was always behind me. Mm-hmm. He wound up quitting after 2 or 3 years. And I mention this today because last week when I watched the Post movie, I learned the next day that he killed himself. Mm-hmm. Exactly as his father did. Bill's father, who'd been the owner of the Washington Post, and had put a bullet through his head. So no. I assume that he was suffering from depression his whole life. But again, a fabulous co-worker, and someone who was very political and left his very influential family in order to find his own way. So we were kind of brother and sister in arms for a little bit. And he too was a clinician. He'd been a trial lawyer at Williams and Connolly for a while. And so it was always there. And again, the good thing about UCLA was Bill Warren, the dean who hired me, was a Republican from Illinois. I knew that. Mm-hmm. And just incredibly supportive. It was a faculty that had robust political conversations and differences. And I always say this, I've been asked to be a dean many times. I never want to be a dean. But to look at a healthy faculty, it has to have cross alliances. Mm-hmm. So Murray, the former more conservative dean, was nice to me, and then in turn I was friends with people who were less political than I was, and I always felt free to speak my mind in that place.
Yeah.
It was amazing. So I will just tell you, since it's relevant to what we're doing here, the first big struggle, I got tenure in 1984.
At UCLA?
At UCLA.
Okay. And was there any difficulty with it?
None at all.
Okay.
I mean, you wouldn't tell me that. I was in therapy because, like anybody pre-tenure, I was totally freaked out and insecure and thought I wasn't going to get it, but it turned out I think it was unanimous, but I didn't know that at the time. But the next big problem was Kitty McKinnon came to visit, and both I and Christine Littleton, who by that time had been hired as a junior faculty member, were big fans of hers. And for anybody who knows anything about Catherine McKinnon, she was a very controversial figure. And her teaching evaluations were bimodal. People either loved her or hated her.
Yeah, I'm sure they were.
So I had just gotten tenure, and I remember I had tenure, and I got up and made a huge speech about how sexist this was, that it was clear that she probably wasn't getting an offer. And I said, you know, there are a whole bunch of people in this world who people don't always like them, and it's because she's a woman, she's not good. So she did not get an offer. Shortly afterwards, she called me and asked if she should sue. By that time, she hadn't gotten offers in a lot of other places, and by that time, Susan Prager was dean, Carol Goldberg was associate dean, there were 4 or 5 women on the faculty. I said, UCLA is not the place to pick your fights with. Mm-hmm. But still, very political. I got made, so did Christine, who actually I don't think had tenure at that time. Very forceful feminists accusing our colleagues of sexism. And, it didn't change the vote, but we personally didn't suffer any adverse consequences from it.
Wow.
And I should say, again, it's very public. I believe that one of the reasons she didn't get a vote was that somebody had seen her, Catherine, being very critical of another woman. And one of our very humanistic male professors said, that's not the way we do things at UCLA. Mm. So very complicated politics.
Right. Which is actually leads me to a question I want to ask you, because you are well known in the feminist circles. How are we doing on time?
Not well.
Okay, so you are very well known in the feminist circles.
Yes.
And the second generation, or second wave cultural or difference feminists, and I thought you've written a lot about that, and that's how I'm familiar with your name. But I see you've also written a ton of other things. So can you talk about how that sort of formed? Because
Yep. This is very important for purposes of this exercise. And here I want to pay homage. I don't know whether her interview was done. We were originally going to interview each other. My more junior to me colleague, Christine Littleton, who went to Harvard and had been a student of Catherine McKinnon's. I was working on women in the legal profession on the side. My primary work was in negotiation and dispute resolution and empirical studies of lawyer decision making. My husband and I, when he became an academic, had a very big grant from the National Science Foundation to do an empirical project. And that's how what I was going to do as a scholar. I was going to do socio-legal empirical studies of lawyering. And then I was writing about the theories of negotiation. On the side, I was writing about women in the legal profession. And I got invited by another one of my colleagues, Rick Abel, into a project called Comparative Legal Profession Project. This was a group of international scholars that were studying the legal profession all over the world. Different, I think 20 different countries. And they went off to a very fancy conference in Bellagio. And everybody reported on the legal profession in France and Ireland and Brazil and Japan. And I sat there and I noticed, as they were reporting on the data, that women were doing every lawyering task that lawyers do, but in each country, the women were doing that which was least valued. So in the United States, where being a trial lawyer was not a big deal anymore, the most prestigious thing was being a corporate lawyer and a partner in a big law firm, women were highly underrepresented. But in some civil law countries, where being a trial lawyer and a prosecutor and wearing a robe and, and the wig and the whole bit was a big deal, women weren't trial lawyers. They were in the firms, in the back offices, maybe doing deals. But this was a Margaret Meadian principle. I had studied with Margaret Mead at Barnard. And Margaret Mead had made some comments about this in Watching Societies as an anthropologist. So I had what I describe as a sociologist as a Durkheimian moment, epiphany, when I saw that the data were telling us how women were being treated. And so I wrote an article, several articles, and a book chapter in Rick's book on comparative legal profession. And then I noticed that women, there was a push-pull effect. So a lot of sociology in this. Women were getting pushed out of that which men regarded as highly prestigious, but they were also pulling themselves into that which they wanted to do. And right around that time, 83, 84, Carol Gilligan's book comes out, and I then controversially and somewhat famously wrote Portia in a Different Voice, arguing that some women, I count myself among them, who cared about the caring part of lawyering, was consistent with my negotiation work, problem solving, doing what's best for the client, doing what's best for the client's children, the client's employees, a holistic view of lawyering. And I argued that the more women in the legal profession that we had might change what was valued in the legal profession. Carol Gilligan was getting trounced by equality feminists. I got trounced by, among others, Joan Williams, who was working on women and work. And so we had a lot of debates between the equality feminists and the difference feminists.
Right, and I think a lot of those debates, I think, are still going
Absolutely.
on. Today, even, and I was read your draft book chapter and found it to be very interesting and contains some very interesting stuff that is useful to something I'm working on. But so that side of you must always come into all of your other scholarship. This idea of the difference feminism, the cultural feminism, sort of informing the rest of your scholarship.
So just a couple of interesting pieces about that. I knew Ruth Bader Ginsburg from my work in the East when I was at Penn, and who argued, I think she was the first person interviewed by Marina Angel for this project, and we were very good, I knew her work. If you read my chapter, we had this very powerful meeting in Washington when a lot of these cases were pending. And it was the Sears case in particular, where the argument was that women were self-selecting into certain jobs, and the argument was no, they were getting pushed that way. It was one of the most important professional meetings I ever went to because we all differed. There were historians, sociologists, and lawyers on both sides. I was on the West Coast, and I described this as West Coast feminism because Christine Littleton had done one of the briefs in one of the pregnancy cases. Almost all the western states, Montana, California, Wyoming, had laws that permitted pregnant women to have a leave. And the eastern states didn't, and the argument was to treat pregnancy like a regular disability and treat it with equality. Wendy Williams ultimately wrote the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. So we continue these debates. I want to say that later when I joined Georgetown's faculty, and Marty Ginsburg was my colleague, so Ruth was my friend as the spouse of a colleague, very touched. One of the great moments of my professional life was when Ruth wrote the decision in VMI, Virginia Military Institute, saying that that school had to be desegregated. She sent me a signed slip opinion and said, I've heard your arguments about the importance of single-sex schools, Barnard, women's colleges. I hope this will satisfy you.
Oh, nice.
Because she had actually written, if you go back and look at it, there's a little paragraph in there that says, although this is what we're doing with VMI, given how important it is, I'm not saying that there isn't some situation out there where we might not need.
Right.
So the debates continue.
Yes.
And we know that. We all know that. And when VMI was being argued, I was very fortunate, I'll just skip ahead because I know we're running out of time, that by the time I got to Georgetown in 1992, when those cases were being argued, I was incredibly blessed because Georgetown had 6 or 7, not just women professors, but active feminist writers. Wendy Williams, Sue Ross, me, Nina Pillard, who was younger, who else? We had like, Robin West, how could I forget that? So I had lunch with today. We had the whole spectrum. And we did a program for the students, and I thought, my God, I hope they know what they have here, because feminism has become so complex, and the crafters of feminist theory and strategy in courts are all in front of you. You've got them on your faculty.
Right.
It was an
and this was in the early 90s?
Mid-90s.
Mid-90s. So, so obviously by this time, at least at Georgetown, not controversial to bring all these very out, if you will, feminists on board was not a problem. So
not
definitely a change in culture, academic culture.
And we disagreed with each other. And again, you could look at, so ironic that I should be a difference feminist, I'm not a mother. You know, the core of Gilligan's argument is that women care for others and they have a connection to others, and pregnancy, whether it's biological or raising children sociologically, we care about others. And I never had children, and I totally identify with that.
But you do have a husband and a family in that way, so.
But at this meeting of all of us, it was ironic. Nina Pillard, now a D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals judge, brilliant woman, was a mother and argued very strongly for equality feminism. And that we were the same as men. She's very lucky. She had a wonderful husband, still does, David Cole, who was an equal parental figure. But I noticed as we were talking that our formative views on these theories came actually not so much from our marital status, but where we went to school. I think the fact that I went to a women's college very much influenced my take on difference feminism, and that a lot of the women that were equality feminists had gone to co-ed schools. Right,
where they wanted the same access to the things that the guys were getting. And I know we are running out of time. So obviously you did. You were at UCLA, you mentioned Georgetown, now you are one of the founding faculty members at UC Irvine. Lots of places in between that you visited, I noticed on your resume.
Harvard, Stanford, and mostly what I do now is, the great joy of my life now is that I teach all over the world. I've taught in 25 countries.
Wow.
And that's what I like to do best now.
Well, I don't blame you. Don't blame you. I do want to get into a little bit of retrospective, though. You've mentioned throughout the way that your sort of some experiences or have sort of circled back on each other. But looking back, would you change anything you have done? And if so, what would you change?
Personally, I'm really sorry I didn't have children. I had 2 miscarriages in my early 40s. So any younger person listening to this, and I tell my students, you can't have it all. Don't wait too long. I think given how my career developed, I clearly could have. The early years were hard. My husband and I were commuting a lot between different places, but at some point we could have, and I'm sorry. That's the biggest regret in my life, that I didn't have children. I think I would love to have been a mother. And I think my husband would have been a fabulous father. And I think he would have, so that's a big regret. Professionally, no regrets at all. And for any younger person watching this tape in the future, if you get anything out of listening to me, it would be true to yourself. I am very proud of those moments when I bucked what other people told me to do. When I wrote my negotiation article, it was rejected at every major law review because it didn't have cases in it, because it was referring to social science literature, political science, economics, game theory. I had John Nash, beautiful mind, Nobel Prize winning mathematician, for those of you who know that literature, I was bringing other literatures into law, very unpopular at the time. I almost didn't get tenure because, that article wasn't getting published. I feel a little bit like the novelist when it got published ultimately in my own law review in UCLA, because I had a student in my class who loved it, and she was editor-in-chief of the law review, and she wanted it. As it got published, it won the first CPR award for best scholarship in dispute resolution. And as they say, the rest is history. From having received that award, I then got asked to speak all over the world on negotiation and problem-solving theory. And if I'd listened to all those people who told me, go find another topic, go write a law review article with cases in it, get rid of the poverty law, which I was still doing, and write about some conventional subject, I wouldn't be here today.
Right.
So, like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who papered his office with rejection letters, I say, hang in there. And when young scholars ask me, what should I write about? This sounds corny, but I really say it. Write what you have a passion about. You have to be committed to what you like. Don't let somebody else tell you what to write.
Right, exactly.
And I just want to say one other thing, which is very important. I thought at least I'd pick something that nobody had written about negotiation. And as I finished my article, I was in New York City in a bookstore, and I saw Getting to Yes, which had just been published. A popular book by Roger Fisher at Harvard, and Bill Urey and Bill Patton, good friends of mine now, Bruce Patton. And I thought, my God, when you're not writing about cases, I didn't think you could be preempted. And there I was, quote, preempted by people that were having similar ideas. I would now say, and I've said it in print, not similar ideas, the culture was changing. I was on the West Coast, they were on the East Coast, and something about the hostility of the adversary system and war, as opposed to peace, had caused, I believe, a number of us to say there must be a better way to be in the world. And so it wasn't preemption so much, and I now regard this as actually affirmation, that I, who was writing this weird stuff that wasn't getting published, had other people in the world thinking the same thoughts. So rather than feeling preempted when someone has similar thoughts than you do, you say, this is great. This means the field, the world, the culture is responding to something.
Right. You're having a conversation
Right
now. Do you think, how have things changed in the years that you have been teaching, both for female legal academics and for female law students?
Great question. A lot. So I just spent part of today visiting with some of my former colleagues at both Georgetown and UCLA. You can hear from this. This whole tape could have gone in the other direction about all the horrible things that happened to women, and I certainly had plenty of those too, being patted on the head, sexual harassment, all of that stuff. Mostly I was very fortunate to be in two schools, Georgetown and UCLA, that were extremely kind and creative and communitarian. I believe today, you're younger than I am, that it is every person for themselves, and I hate what I see. And UCI, interesting, complicated story to start a whole new law school. But I would say in general, although my colleagues would say they're helping each other, they're all about themselves. Less work on committees. There's not sexism at my school. We have a lot of women and a faculty of a lot of people of color. It's very diverse. But there's not that knitting together of a family. Now, maybe because I'm one of the older ones on the faculty, I think the younger people who have children and share their children together, it's not a family at UCI. It's people teaching classes and writing with, Rachel's an exception. She's an incredibly maternal, wonderful, students love her, and she makes a warm, wonderful office. But in general, and UCI itself is a small school where I think the students would tell you they all feel very supported. But I think the world today is, it's harder to get jobs, it's harder to get tenure. The pressures are enormous. I think the standards for tenure are probably harder than they were when I went through. And I think it's a much more individualistic world. And as you well know, there are hierarchies of subject matter, which have always irritated me personally. So, con law's at the top,
right.
And all the soft, mushy subjects like ADR and legal research and writing and various things, or interviewing and counseling, incredibly important for lawyering, are valued less.
Very much, yeah.
And so I spent my career trying to say they're all important, and yet that hierarchy is there. And I guess the other thing, I've just been ruminating on this today, my world was a very much in-person world. People showed up at colloquia, people hang out in each other's offices and have intellectual discussions. Everybody's on email and blogging and texting, and so at almost every law school, you walk the halls. Not Marquette, I love Marquette. I think Marquette is the most beautiful physical law school in the United States of America right now, and I will tell anybody who says that. The fireplaces.
Oh, they're wonderful.
I would like to create that kind of hearth at UCI, and we don't have it.
Right.
And Georgetown certainly doesn't have it. Long, long corridors, and increasingly people are at home and not with each other. That's changed, I don't like it.
Too distant, so that's part of, that sort of fits exactly with your, your feminist beliefs of this sort of caring and community, which is very different when everybody's in very different places, physically not there now, a lot of virtual communication. Do you have anything else that you would like to say that I didn't ask you about? I know we have way more stuff to talk about than we have time, but...
The important thing, it's interesting, when you ask me about regrets, I've been asked to be a dean several times, and I'm glad I haven't. I just want to say I've had a number of good friends. Judy Wegner, who was president of the AALS and was my friend, fabulous dean in North Carolina. Judy Irvine at Georgetown, now the president of the AALS, best dean I ever had. Very different kinds of deans. I think it's extremely important for women to be deans. The role modeling is extremely important. Judy taught a wonderful course in decision making and leadership at Georgetown. I did a couple of classes. I still believe women make decisions differently than men do. I personally, I'm glad I never did, because as you can tell, I like to speak the truth to power. I'm a very honest person, and deans can't always be that. I'm not saying they're lying, but they have to give messages.
Have to walk a line.
They have to give different messages to different people. And I want to say this profession of being a law professor, for those of us that continue to practice and be activists and to teach the next generation, is just the best job in the world. So I hope that future generations that watch these tapes and they hear about the struggles that some of the first generation had, it was all worth it. And I would just sort of say, hang in there. As I reach whatever the last 10 years of my career may be, I still write. I love teaching, and I just think it's a wonderful way to spend a career. And I also want to say that so I was practicing law, and it's really important for my work in the sociology of the profession for women to be in all parts of the profession. So they need to teach, they need to be deans, and they also need to practice.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your time.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
It was really
very
lovely.
much.